The stagecoach lurched violently to the right, throwing Florence Davies against the wooden frame hard enough to bruise her shoulder, and through the frosted window she could see nothing but white, an endless, suffocating white that seemed determined to erase the world itself. "We cannot go any farther," the driver shouted above the howling wind, his voice barely reaching her ears through the walls of the coach. "Storm's getting worse by the minute." Florence pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass, her breath creating small circles of fog that quickly froze into delicate patterns. She had traveled all the way from Philadelphia to California, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride placed by a rancher near Hangtown. The journey had taken weeks, and now, mere miles from her destination, according to the driver's estimation that morning, nature had decided to intervene with the worst blizzard anyone had seen in years. "There's a ranch not far from here," another voice called out, deeper and more commanding. Florence realized one of the other passengers must have ridden up top with the driver. "Maybe a mile north. I can see smoke." "Can we make it?" the driver asked, doubt heavy in his tone. "We have to try. Another hour in this and the horses will freeze where they stand." The coach lurched forward again, slower this time, the horses struggling against the mounting drifts. Florence pulled her wool traveling cloak tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to ward off the cold that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice. Her trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, was strapped to the top of the coach. She hoped it would survive this detour. She thought of the letters she had exchanged with Martin Whitfield, the rancher who had placed the advertisement. His words had been proper, if somewhat stiff, describing his property and his need for a wife to help manage his household. He was 43, he had written, never married, with a successful cattle operation. Florence, at 24, had few prospects in Philadelphia. Her father had died 2 years prior, leaving debts that consumed everything. Her mother had passed when Florence was just a girl. Marriage to a Western rancher had seemed like an opportunity for a fresh start. A new life far from the whispers and pitying looks of neighbors who had watched the Davies family fall from modest comfort into poverty. Now, as the wind screamed and the world disappeared into white chaos, she wondered if she would even survive to meet the man who was supposed to become her husband. The coach came to a sudden, jarring stop. Florence heard voices outside, muffled by the storm. Then the door opened and a blast of icy air and snow rushed in, nearly stealing her breath. "Madam, we need to get you inside. Now." The man who spoke was tall, his face wrapped in a thick scarf, his hat pulled low. All she could see were his eyes, a striking gray-blue that reminded her of storm clouds. "Can you walk?" "Yes, I think so," Florence said, though her legs had gone numb from sitting in the cold for so many hours. He reached in and took her arm, helping her down from the coach. The moment her feet touched the ground, the wind nearly knocked her over. The man's arm went around her waist, steady and strong, practically carrying her through snow that reached past her knees. She could barely see the structure ahead, just a dark shape in the swirling white. But as they drew closer, it resolved into a ranch house, solid and substantial, with light glowing warmly in the windows. The door opened before they reached it, and more hands pulled her inside, into blessed warmth and the smell of wood smoke and coffee. Florence stumbled, would have fallen, but the man who had helped her from the coach kept his grip firm, guiding her to a chair near the massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. "Get those wet things off her," a woman's voice said, sharp with concern. "She is frozen through." Florence's hands were shaking too badly to manage the buttons of her cloak. The woman, elderly with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, stepped forward and began helping her with quick, efficient movements. Soon the wet cloak was gone, and a thick quilt was wrapped around Florence's shoulders. Someone pressed a cup of something hot into her hands. She sipped carefully. Coffee, strong and slightly bitter, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you," she managed to say, her teeth chattering. "Thank you so much." "Do not thank me yet," the man who had carried her said, unwrapping the scarf from his face. Florence got her first clear look at him and felt her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 at most, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and those remarkable eyes. His dark hair was wet from the snow, curling slightly at the ends. "That storm is not letting up. You'll be stuck here for a while." "How long is a while?" Florence asked. "Could be days," he said, pulling off his heavy coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Storm like this, it settles in and takes its time." "Days." Florence felt panic rising in her chest. "But I'm expected in Hangtown. Mr. Whitfield, he's waiting for me. He'll be worried." The man's expression shifted, something Florence could not quite read flickering across his features. "You're Whitfield's bride?" "Yes, I'm Florence Davies. The stage coach was supposed to arrive this afternoon." "No one's going anywhere in this weather," the elderly woman said firmly. "That man will understand if he has any sense. I am Mrs. Chen. This is my kitchen and you're welcome to it until the storm passes." "I'm Connor Nash," the man said, and Florence noticed he did not smile. "This is my ranch. You're about 5 miles southeast of the Whitfield property." "Then you know him, Mr. Whitfield?" "I know him." Something in Connor's tone made it clear the acquaintance was not a pleasant one, but he did not elaborate. "Mrs. Chen, how are the others? The driver and the other passenger are seeing to the horses in the barn," Mrs. Chen said. "I have stew on. Everyone will need hot food." Connor nodded and moved toward the window, looking out at the wall of white beyond the glass. Florence watched him, noting the way he carried himself, the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own space. The ranch house was well built and well kept, the furniture simple but solid, everything speaking of a man who valued quality and function over flash. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this," Florence said. "If there were any other option." "There is not," Connor said, turning back to face her. "And you're not imposing. No one gets turned away in weather like this. That is how people die." His bluntness was startling after the careful politeness of the letters she had exchanged with Martin Whitfield, but Florence found it oddly reassuring. This was a man who dealt in truths, not pretty words. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, partly to fill the silence, partly because she found herself genuinely curious. "Built this place 7 years ago," Connor said. He moved to the fireplace and added another log, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "Rang cattle mostly, some horses. It is a good life." "Lonely, though," Mrs. Chen interjected, giving Connor a pointed look. "Man needs more than cows and horses for company. I have you, don't I?" Connor said, and this time there was a hint of warmth in his voice, almost affection. "I'm the housekeeper, not family," Mrs. Chen said tartly. "Not the same thing at all." Florence found herself smiling despite her anxiety about the storm and her delayed arrival in Hangtown. The easy banter between Connor and his housekeeper reminded her of home, of better times before her father's death. The door opened again, admitting another gust of wind and 2 more men. One was the stagecoach driver, a grizzled man of about 50 with frost in his beard. The other was perhaps 40, well dressed in a traveling suit that was now soaked and ruined. "Horses are settled," the driver said. "That was close. Another half hour and we would have lost them all." "We were fortunate Connor saw the smoke from his chimney," the other man said. He had a smooth voice, cultured, with a slight accent Florence could not quite place. "I'm Richard Sterling. I was traveling to Sacramento on business." "Florence Davies," she replied. "I'm going to Hangtown." "Ah, that explains the driver's determination to push on despite the weather," Sterling said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Chen with a nod of thanks. "Mail order bride, I assume. The driver mentioned something about it this morning." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "Yes. Nothing to be ashamed of," Sterling said easily. "Half the women in California came here the same way. More honest than most marriages back east, if you ask me. At least everyone knows exactly what they are getting into." "Mr. Sterling is a lawyer," the driver said, settling into a chair with a groan. "Spent the whole morning trying to convince me the stagecoach company is liable for every bump in the road." "Not liable, merely responsible for reasonable comfort," Sterling said with a slight smile. "But that debate can wait. Right now, I'm more concerned with warmth and food in that order." Mrs. Chen ladled stew into bowls and passed them around. The smell alone was enough to make Florence's mouth water. She realized she had not eaten since early morning, a hurried breakfast at the last way station. The stew was rich and hearty, full of tender beef and vegetables, seasoned perfectly. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling warmth spread through her body. Connor ate standing up, watching the storm through the window. The wind had picked up even more, if that was possible, rattling the shutters and howling like something alive and angry. "This is unusual for March," Sterling observed. "I thought spring was supposed to be mild here." "Weather does what it wants in the mountains," Connor said. "You cannot predict it, you can only deal with it." "How philosophical," Sterling said, though his tone was respectful rather than mocking. "Have you lived here long enough?" Connor said. He set his empty bowl on the table and looked at Florence. "You'll need somewhere to sleep. Mrs. Chen, can you set up the guest room?" "Already done," Mrs. Chen said. "Miss Davies will be comfortable enough." "And the rest of us?" Sterling asked. "Barn has a loft with clean straw and plenty of blankets," Connor said. "It is warm enough with the horses below. You will not freeze." "Rustic, but acceptable under the circumstances," Sterling said. "Better than dying in a snowdrift." The driver nodded his agreement, already looking half asleep in his chair by the fire. The evening passed slowly. The storm showed no signs of abating, and conversation eventually dwindled as exhaustion set in. Sterling produced a pack of cards and tried to interest the driver in a game, but the older man declined, preferring to doze. Connor disappeared outside twice, checking on the animals and making sure everything was secured against the wind. Each time he returned covered in fresh snow, his face red from the cold. Florence found her eyes drawn to him repeatedly. There was something compelling about the way he moved, economical and purposeful, nothing wasted. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. It was clear this was his domain, and he commanded it with quiet authority. "You should get some rest," Connor said to Florence as the clock on the mantel chimed 9. "Storm like this, it wears on you even when you're inside." "I am rather tired," Florence admitted. The warmth of the fire and the hot food had made her sleepy, though her mind was still racing with questions and worries. Mrs. Chen appeared from somewhere in the back of the house. "Come along, dear. Room is ready." Florence followed the older woman down a hallway to a small but comfortable bedroom. The bed was piled with quilts, and a fire burned in a small stove in the corner, making the space cozy and warm. "There is water in the pitcher if you need to wash," Mrs. Chen said, "and a nightdress in the drawer. Belonged to Connor's mother. She was about your size, I think." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You have been so kind." "Just doing what is right," the housekeeper said. "Storm will pass. Everything will work out the way it is supposed to." The words were meant to be comforting, Florence knew, but they stirred up her anxiety again. What was supposed to happen? She was meant to marry Martin Whitfield, start a new life as a rancher's wife. But now she was stranded here, in Connor Nash's house, and something about that felt both dangerous and oddly right in a way she could not explain. She changed into the nightdress, which was soft flannel worn smooth from many washings. Climbing into the bed, she found the quilts heavy and warm, the mattress comfortable. Outside, the wind continued its relentless howling, but here in this small room she felt safe. Sleep came quickly, but her dreams were troubled, full of swirling snow and gray-blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, it seemed worse, the wind shrieking around the house with renewed fury. Florence woke to find her dress from the previous day cleaned and dried, hanging on a peg by the door. Mrs. Chen's work, no doubt. She dressed quickly, braided her long auburn hair, and ventured out into the main room. Connor was already up, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. He glanced over as she entered, and she thought she saw something flicker in his expression before it smoothed back into careful neutrality. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well." "Very well, thank you. I hope I have not caused too much trouble." "No trouble." He took a sip of his coffee. "Storm is not going anywhere. Might be here another day at least." Florence moved closer to the window, looking out at the white maelstrom. The world had been completely transformed, buried under feet of snow, the familiar shapes of fence posts and trees rendered strange and alien by the drifts. "I have never seen anything like this." "It is rare," Connor admitted, "but it happens. You learn to respect the weather out here. It can kill you if you are not careful." "Is that why you saved us yesterday? Because you have seen people die in storms like this?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was softer, almost contemplative. "Lost a friend my first winter here. He thought he could make it home in a snowstorm. They found him 3 days later, frozen solid not half a mile from his door. I swore then I would never let that happen to anyone else if I could prevent it." The raw honesty in his words touched something deep in Florence's chest. This was not a man who spoke of his feelings easily, she realized. That he had shared this with her felt significant, though she could not say exactly why. "I am sorry for your loss," she said quietly. Connor nodded, still looking out at the storm. "It was a long time ago, Mrs. Chen emerged from the kitchen with a plate of eggs and bacon, somehow managing to make breakfast despite the limited supplies. The driver and Sterling appeared shortly after, both looking rumpled but rested. "Any chance this lets up today?" Sterling asked, warming his hands by the fire. "Not likely," Connor said. "These storms, they take their time." "So we are stuck," the driver said, though he did not sound particularly upset about it. "Could be worse. Could be stuck with poor food and no heat." They passed the day in quiet activity. Connor disappeared into a room he used as an office, working on accounts and ranch business. Sterling read a book he produced from his traveling bag, some dense legal tome that looked impossibly dull to Florence. The driver worked on repairing a bridle, his gnarled fingers moving with surprising dexterity. Florence helped Mrs. Chen in the kitchen, grateful for something to do. The older woman was a wealth of practical knowledge, sharing tips about cooking and household management as they worked. She had come to California 20 years ago, she told Florence, following her husband who had hoped to strike gold. He had died in a mining accident, leaving her alone in a strange land. Connor's father had hired her as a housekeeper, and she had stayed on after his death, watching Connor grow from a boy into the man he was now. "He is a good man," Mrs. Chen said, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. "Quiet but good, takes his responsibilities seriously." "Sometimes too seriously." "What do you mean?" Florence asked, genuinely curious. He works hard, harder than he needs to, rarely takes time for himself, never goes to town unless he has to for supplies. Mrs. Chen shaped the dough into loaves and set them aside to rise. Lonely life for a young man. Why hasn't he married? The question came out before Florence could think better of it. Forgive me, that is none of my business. It is a reasonable question, Mrs. Chen said. Truth is, I think he has not found the right woman. The girls in town, they see him as a good provider, a solid choice. But Connor, he wants more than that. He wants someone who sees him, not just his ranch and his prospects. Florence understood that longing all too well. Her letters from Martin Whitfield had been full of practical considerations, discussions of household duties and the operation of his ranch. Never once had he asked about her interests, her hopes, what made her laugh or what she feared. She had told herself it did not matter, that marriage was a partnership of convenience more often than not. But standing in this warm kitchen, listening to Mrs. Chen talk about a man who wanted to be seen, she felt a pang of something she could not quite name. Longing, perhaps, or recognition. That afternoon, restlessness drove Connor to check on the animals again despite the raging storm. Florence watched him bundle up, wrapping his scarf around his face, pulling on heavy gloves. He caught her watching and paused. "Want to see the horses?" he asked. "Quick trip to the barn and back." Florence was surprised by the invitation but found herself nodding. "Yes, I would like that." He found her a coat, far too large but warm, and helped her wrap a scarf around her head and face. Then they stepped out into the storm together. The cold was shocking, stealing her breath despite the scarf. The wind pushed at her, trying to knock her down, but Connor's arm was around her waist again, holding her steady as he had the day before. They pushed through the deep snow, every step an effort, until they reached the barn. Connor hauled the door open just enough for them to slip through, then shut it firmly behind them. Inside, the barn was dim but much warmer than outside, heated by the presence of the animals. Florence could see the stagecoach horses in stalls, munching contentedly on hay. Connor's own horses occupied other stalls, along with several cows. Everything was clean and well maintained, the floors swept, the animals obviously well cared for. "They look comfortable," Florence said, pulling down her scarf so she could speak more clearly. "Animals know how to weather a storm better than most people," Connor said. He moved down the line of stalls, checking water buckets and hay supplies. "They just accept it and wait it out." Florence followed him, watching the easy way he handled the animals, speaking softly to each one. One of his horses, a beautiful chestnut mare, nickered and pushed her nose against his chest. He smiled, actually smiled, and the transformation of his face was remarkable. He looked younger, more open, the careful guardedness falling away. "She is beautiful," Florence said. "This is Copper," Connor said, stroking the mare's neck. "Raised her from a foal. Best horse I have ever owned." "May I?" Florence reached out tentatively and Connor nodded. She touched the mare's soft nose and Copper huffed warm breath against her palm. Florence laughed, delighted. "Hello, Copper." Connor watched her with an expression she could not quite read. "You like horses?" "I do, though I have not been around them much. My father kept a carriage horse, but I was never allowed to visit the stable. He thought it was not proper for a young lady." She stroked Copper's neck, marveling at the warmth and strength beneath the smooth coat. "I always wanted to learn to ride." "It is not difficult," Connor said. "Just takes practice and a good teacher. Would you teach me?" The words came out before she could think about them, impulsive and entirely too forward. Connor was quiet for a long moment, and Florence felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. Of course he would not want to teach her. She was engaged to his neighbor, would be leaving as soon as the storm passed. It was inappropriate to even ask. But then he said, "Yes. When the weather clears before you leave, I will teach you." The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them spoke aloud. Florence knew she should say something about Martin Whitfield, about her obligations, but the words would not come. Instead, she just nodded, her hand still resting on Copper's warm neck. They returned to the house shortly after, fighting their way back through the storm. Inside, Florence was shaking from cold and something else, an excitement she could not quite name. Mrs. Chen took one look at her flushed face and knowing smile but said nothing, just pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. That evening, after supper, Sterling convinced the driver to play cards. Connor sat by the fire, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but Florence noticed his eyes rarely moved on the page. She had found a basket of mending and was working on repairing a torn shirt, the simple repetitive work soothing to her nerves. "Miss Davies," Sterling said during a break in the card game, "if you do not mind my asking, what made you decide to come west as a mail-order bride?" Florence considered the question. She could give the simple answer, the practical one about finances and opportunities. But something about the quiet intimacy of the room, the storm howling outside, made her want to tell the truth. "My father died 2 years ago," she said, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. "He left debts. Everything we owned was sold to pay them. I worked as a seamstress for a time, then as a companion to an elderly lady, but the pay was barely enough to survive. When I saw Mr. Whitfield's advertisement, it seemed like a chance for something more, a real home, a purpose." "That is honest," Sterling said. "More honest than most people would be." "What about love?" Connor asked, and everyone turned to look at him. He was watching Florence with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "Did you consider that?" "I considered it a luxury I could not afford," Florence said, meeting his gaze directly. "Love is for people with choices. I have none." "Everyone has choices," Connor said. "Easy to say when you have money and land and freedom," Florence replied, an edge of sharpness in her voice. "Harder when you are alone in the world with no family and no prospects." Connor's jaw tightened and she thought she had offended him, but then he nodded slowly. "You are right. I apologize. That was not fair of me to say." The apology surprised her. Men in her experience rarely admitted fault, especially to women. "I should not have snapped at you. You have been nothing but kind to me." "You spoke truth," Connor said. "Nothing wrong with that." The conversation moved on, but Florence felt the weight of Connor's gaze returning to her throughout the evening. When she finally retired to bed, her mind was racing. Everything was becoming complicated in ways she had not anticipated. She was supposed to marry Martin Whitfield. That was the plan, the purpose of her entire journey. But here, in this ranch house, with this quiet, intense cowboy who looked at her like she was something precious and rare, she was beginning to question everything. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. By afternoon, Florence was feeling the strain of confinement, the endless howling of the wind wearing on her nerves. She stood at the window, staring out at the white void, feeling trapped. "It will end," Connor said, appearing beside her so quietly she had not heard him approach. "Storms always do." "I know. I just feel so useless, sitting here doing nothing while my entire life is being delayed." "Is that what bothers you? The delay?" Florence turned to look at him. He was close, closer than propriety would normally allow, and she could see flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes like storm clouds shot through with lightning. "I do not know what bothers me anymore." "You are having doubts," Connor said. "It was not a question." "I should not be." "I made a commitment. Mr. Whitfield is expecting me." "Martin Whitfield is a hard man," Connor said, his voice low. "Not cruel, but hard. He will expect you to work from dawn to dusk, managing his household, bearing his children, asking nothing for yourself. Is that the life you want? How do you know what he expects? Because I know him. Our properties border each other. I have seen how he treats his workers, his animals. He is not unkind, but there is no warmth in him, no softness. Connor's hand came up, almost touching her cheek but stopping just short. You deserve better than that. Florence's breath caught. What do I deserve? To be seen. To be valued for more than what you can do, to be loved. The word hung between them, heavy and dangerous and thrilling. Florence knew she should step back, should remind him and herself of her obligations. But she found herself swaying forward instead, drawn by a force she could not name. The door banged open, and they sprang apart like guilty children. Sterling entered, stamping snow from his boots. Any chance of a hot drink? I just made a run to check on the stagecoach horses, and I swear my blood has frozen solid. Of course, Connor said, his voice perfectly controlled, though Florence could see tension in the set of his shoulders. I will get you some coffee. He left the room, and Florence was grateful for the moment to compose herself. Her heart was pounding, her hands shaking. What was she doing? She could not develop feelings for Connor Nash. It was impossible, impractical, a complication she absolutely could not afford. But as the afternoon wore on, and she watched him move around the house, speaking quietly to Mrs. Chen, adding logs to the fire, checking the windows to make sure they were sealed against the cold, she knew it was already too late. She had fallen for this quiet, strong man who looked at her like she mattered, who asked her questions about what she wanted instead of just what she could provide. That evening, after the others had gone to bed, Florence found herself unable to sleep. She wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and ventured out into the main room, thinking she would sit by the dying fire and try to sort through her tangled thoughts. Connor was already there, sitting in a chair pulled close to the hearth, staring into the embers. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Could not sleep, he finally asked. Too much on my mind. Same here. He gestured to another chair. Company might help. Florence sat, pulling the quilt tighter. The fire popped and hissed, sending up small showers of sparks. Outside, the storm had finally begun to quiet, the wind's howl diminishing to a low moan. Storm is breaking, Connor observed. By morning, it should be clear enough to travel. That is good, Florence said, though the words tasted like lies. Is it? She looked at him, at the firelight playing across his features, casting shadows and highlights that made him look like something out of a dream. It should be. It is what I came here for. But not what you want. What I want does not matter. It matters to me. Connor leaned forward, his eyes intense. Florence, I know I have no right to say this. I know you have obligations, commitments you made before you ever came here. But these last 2 days, having you here, talking to you, watching you with Copper and helping Mrs. Chen and just being here in my home, it has made me realize something. What? The word came out barely above a whisper. This is where you are meant to be. He said it with absolute conviction, like it was a simple fact. Not with Whitfield, here with me. Florence felt tears prick her eyes. Connor, I cannot just abandon my commitment. What kind of person would that make me? A person brave enough to choose happiness over obligation. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. I am not a man who speaks of feelings easily, never have been. But I feel something for you, Florence, something I have never felt before. Like you fit here in this place in my life. Like everything makes sense when you are near. I feel it too, she whispered, the admission tearing out of her. That is what frightens me. Why should it frighten you? Because it is so fast, so sudden. We barely know each other. How can I trust this feeling? The same way you trusted the feeling that brought you west in the first place. Connor said. "Sometimes you just know, deep in your bones, that something is right. This feels right to me. Does it feel right to you?" Florence looked at their joined hands, at the way his thumb was stroking gentle circles on her palm. She thought about Martin Whitfield, waiting in Hangtown, a man she had never met, whose letters had been polite but cold. Then she thought about Connor, who had saved her life, who looked at her like she was precious, who wanted to teach her to ride horses and who spoke to her about truth and choices and being seen. "Yes," she said finally. "It feels right." Connor's face transformed with a smile that made her heart skip. He stood, pulling her up with him, and for a moment they just stood there, hands clasped, looking at each other in the firelight. Then he cupped her face with his free hand, his touch gentle, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She did not want to. His kiss was soft at first, tentative, questioning. Florence answered by leaning into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. The kiss deepened, and she felt heat flood through her that had nothing to do with the fire. This was what it was supposed to feel like, she realized. This connection, this sense of coming home to a place she had never been before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Connor rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said. "Please, just say you will stay." "What about Mr. Whitfield? He is expecting a bride." "I will deal with Whitfield. I will make sure he understands this was not about dishonoring him or the commitment you made. I will handle everything. Just say you will stay." Florence thought about all the practical reasons she should say no. She barely knew this man. Everything was happening too fast. People would talk, would question her character. But then she remembered what Mrs. Chen had said about Connor wanting someone who saw him, not just his ranch and his prospects. And she realized that was what she wanted too. To be seen, to be chosen, not for what she could provide but for who she was. "Yes," she said. "I will stay." Connor kissed her again, longer this time, deeper, full of promise and passion and a kind of desperate relief. When they finally separated, both of them were smiling. "We should probably try to get some sleep," Connor said, though he made no move to let her go. "Probably," Florence agreed, equally reluctant to leave the circle of his arms. "Tomorrow I will ride to Hangtown. I will speak to Whitfield, explain the situation. It will not be pleasant, but it is the right thing to do." "Should I come with you?" "No. Better I handle this man to man. Whitfield is proud. He will take it better for me alone." Florence nodded, trusting his judgment. "What do I do in the meantime? You stay here. You are home now, Florence. This is where you are meant to be." Those words, the ones he had spoken earlier with such conviction, settled over her like a benediction. Home. She had been searching for a home for so long, a place where she belonged. And she had found it, not in the destination she had planned for, but in this unexpected detour, in the arms of a cowboy who had saved her from the storm. They parted reluctantly, each going to their separate rooms, but Florence's heart felt lighter than it had in years. She climbed into bed and fell asleep almost immediately, dreaming not of snow and cold, but of spring sunshine and a chestnut mare and gray-blue eyes full of warmth. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally spent. Florence woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of voices in the main room. She dressed quickly and emerged to find the stagecoach driver and Sterling preparing to leave. "Road should be clear enough to make it to Hangtown by afternoon," the driver was saying. "Assuming we do not hit more drifts." "What about you, Miss Davies?" Sterling asked, giving her a knowing look. "Are you continuing on to meet your intended?" Florence glanced at Connor, who was standing by the window. He met her eyes and gave a small nod of encouragement. "No," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I have decided to remain here." The driver looked surprised but said nothing. Sterling, however, smiled. "I thought that might be the case. You two have been circling each other like planets caught in orbit for 2 days now. I hope you will be very happy together." "Thank you," Florence said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. After breakfast, the driver and Sterling prepared to depart. Connor helped them hitch the horses to the stagecoach, and they pulled away with waves and good wishes. Florence's trunk, she noticed, had been brought down from the coach and now sat in the hallway of the ranch house. Once they were alone, Connor turned to Florence. "I need to ride to Hangtown today. Speak to Whitfield. It is not something I can put off. I understand. Mrs. Chen will be here with you. I should be back before dark." He hesitated, then took her hand. "Are you sure about this? Last chance to change your mind." "I am sure," Florence said. "Are you?" "More sure than I have ever been about anything." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and utterly charming. "When I get back, we need to talk about what comes next, how we do this properly." "Properly? Marriage, Florence. I am not asking you to just live here. I am asking you to be my wife." The word sent a thrill through her. Wife. Not in the contractual, obligatory way she had imagined with Martin Whitfield, but in a real way, a way that meant partnership and love and a shared life. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Connor pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, and Florence felt tears slip down her cheeks. But they were happy tears. Tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude that a blizzard had stranded her in exactly the right place. He left shortly after, riding out on a sturdy black gelding, heading toward Hangtown. Florence watched until he disappeared from view, then turned to find Mrs. Chen watching her with a satisfied expression. "I knew it," the older woman said. "From the first moment I saw him look at you, I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were the woman who would finally make Connor understand what he had been missing." Mrs. Chen took Florence's arm and led her toward the kitchen. "Now come, we have work to do, a wedding to plan, even if it is a simple one." The hours passed slowly while Connor was gone. Florence helped Mrs. Chen with household tasks, learning the routines of the ranch. She discovered where things were kept, how the big stove worked, the best way to hang laundry so it would dry evenly. It was good, honest work, and she found satisfaction in it, especially knowing she was learning how to manage what would soon be her own household. In the early afternoon, Mrs. Chen sent her out to collect eggs from the chicken coop. The snow had started to melt in the bright sunshine, creating muddy patches everywhere. Florence picked her way carefully across the yard, marveling at how different everything looked from the storm. The world had been reborn, washed clean, full of possibility. She was just returning with a basket of eggs when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart leaped, thinking Connor was returning, but as the rider came closer she realized it was someone else. A man older with a hard face and cold eyes. He dismounted near the porch, his gaze fixed on Florence. "You must be Miss Davies." "I am," Florence said, setting down her basket. "And you are Martin Whitfield, your intended husband." Florence felt her stomach drop. "Mr. Whitfield, I did not expect to see you here. I heard the stagecoach made it through after the storm. When you did not arrive in Hangtown, I figured you must have ended up here." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Connor Nash and I are not friends, but I know he would not turn away travelers in a storm." "Mr. Whitfield, there is something I need to tell you." "Save it," he said, his tone cutting. "I can see it in your face. You are not coming to Hangtown. You are staying here with Nash." Florence lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. "Yes, I am sorry, Mr. Whitfield. I know I made a commitment to you and I do not take breaking it lightly, but circumstances have changed." "Circumstances," Whitfield repeated, and now there was anger in his voice. "Let me guess. Nash turned your head with his pretty ranch and his young face. Never mind the promises you made, the money I spent on your passage out here. I will repay you for the passage, Florence said, though she had no idea how she would manage it. Every penny, I promise. And what about my lost time? The preparations I made, the fact that I trusted you to keep your word. I am truly sorry, Florence said. But I cannot marry you, Mr. Whitfield. My heart is elsewhere. Your heart, he said with contempt. You think hearts matter in a place like this? This is hard country, Miss Davies. It breaks pretty girls who think love will be enough. You will regret this choice. Maybe, Florence said. But it is my choice to make. Whitfield stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. Fine. Stay with Nash, but do not expect the rest of us to welcome you with open arms. Everyone will know you are the bride who broke her word. That kind of reputation does not wash off easily. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Florence stood watching him go, her hands shaking slightly. Mrs. Chen appeared on the porch, having witnessed the entire exchange. Are you all right, dear? Yes, Florence said, though her voice was unsteady. Yes, I think so. That man has a mean streak, Mrs. Chen said. You are well rid of him. I hope Connor does not run into him on the road. If he does, Connor can handle himself. Do not worry. But Florence did worry all through the afternoon, until finally, as the sun was beginning to set, she saw Connor riding back across the fields. She ran out to meet him, not caring about propriety or dignity, just needing to know he was safe. He dismounted and caught her in his arms, spinning her around. Easy, easy, I am fine. Whitfield was here, Florence said breathlessly. He came while you were gone. He was angry. Connor's expression darkened. What did he say? That I will regret choosing you. That people will know I broke my word. He wanted me to feel ashamed. And do you feel ashamed? No, Florence said firmly. I made the right choice, I know it. Connor smiled and kissed her forehead. Good, because I rode all the way to Hangtown for nothing. Whitfield was not there. Must have heard you were here and came straight over. I told him I would repay him for the cost of my passage. I will take care of it, Connor said. Money is not the issue. The issue is he feels rejected, and men like Whitfield do not handle rejection well, but he will get over it. He will find another bride, someone better suited to him. He said people will talk about me. Let them talk. We know the truth. That is all that matters. Connor cupped her face in his hands. Florence, I do not care what anyone thinks. I care about you, about building a life with you here. Can you live with that? Yes, she said. I can live with that very well. That evening, over dinner, they talked about the future. Connor wanted to get married as soon as possible. No point in waiting, he said. Mrs. Chen suggested they ride into the small town of Coloma, about 15 miles west, where there was a church and a minister who could perform the ceremony. Florence agreed, still amazed at how quickly her entire life had transformed. What about your family? Connor asked. Do you need to write to anyone? Let them know. I have no family left, Florence said. There is no one who will worry or wonder. Something in her voice must have given away her sadness because Connor reached across the table and took her hand. You have a family now. Me, Mrs. Chen. You are not alone anymore. The simple kindness of the words made tears prick Florence's eyes again. She was not used to this, to being cared for, to mattering to someone. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Chen produced a dress that had belonged to Connor's mother, a simple but beautiful gown in pale blue that fit Florence almost perfectly with just a few alterations. Connor rode into Coloma to speak with the minister and arrange the wedding. They decided on a date 1 week away, enough time to prepare but not so long that it felt like unnecessary delay. Florence spent her days learning the rhythms of the ranch, working alongside Mrs. Chen, and spending time with Connor in the evenings. He was a man of few words, but she was learning to read him, to understand the small gestures and subtle expressions that conveyed his thoughts and feelings. She was learning, too, how to run a household in this harsh landscape, so different from the city life she had known. True to his promise, Connor took her out to the barn one afternoon to teach her to ride. He saddled Copper, speaking softly to the mare, then helped Florence mount. The feeling of being on horseback was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "Easy," Connor said, his hand on her knee steadying her. "Just relax. Let your body move with the horse." He led Copper around the corral slowly, letting Florence get used to the rhythm. After a while he let go and Florence was riding on her own, Copper responding to her gentle guidance. She laughed with pure joy and Connor grinned up at her, his face more open and happy than she had ever seen it. "You are a natural," he said. "I have a good teacher." They spent an hour in the corral, Connor patiently correcting her posture and showing her how to use the reins properly. By the end, Florence was tired but triumphant, and when Connor helped her dismount, she found herself in his arms, his face very close to hers. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For seeing me. For wanting me here. For making me believe I deserve this happiness." "You deserve everything good in this world," Connor said. And then he kissed her, tender and sweet, full of promise. The week passed too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Florence found herself impatient for the wedding day, eager to officially become Connor's wife, but also cherishing these quiet days of courtship, of learning each other, of building the foundation of their life together. The night before the wedding, Mrs. Chen shooed Connor out of the house, insisting it was bad luck for him to see Florence. He went with good-natured grumbling, heading to the barn to sleep in the loft. "Silly tradition," he muttered, but he went anyway. Florence lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of tomorrow. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the stagecoach ride across the country, the storm, the unexpected detour that had changed everything. If the blizzard had not hit, if they had made it to Hangtown on schedule, she would have married Martin Whitfield and likely lived a perfectly respectable, perfectly miserable life. Instead, she had found love in the most unexpected place. Morning dawned bright and clear. Mrs. Chen helped Florence into the blue dress, arranging her auburn hair in an elaborate style, weaving in small flowers she had somehow managed to preserve from last summer. When Florence looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked happy, she realized. Truly, deeply happy, perhaps for the first time in her adult life. They traveled to Coloma in Connor's wagon, Mrs. Chen accompanying them as witness. The town was small but bustling, full of miners and merchants and all the rough vitality of the California frontier. The church was a simple wooden structure, but inside it was clean and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows. The minister was a kind-faced man named Reverend Thomas, who spoke briefly with Connor and Florence before the ceremony. "Marriage is a sacred bond," he said, "not to be entered into lightly. Do you both understand the commitment you are making?" "Yes," Connor said firmly. "I do," Florence agreed. "Then let us begin." The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Connor spoke his vows in a steady voice, his eyes never leaving Florence's face. When it was her turn, Florence's voice trembled slightly, overwhelmed by emotion, but she got through it, promising to love and honor this man who had become her whole world in such a short time. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas said. "You may kiss your bride." Connor did, right there in front of God and Mrs. Chen and the minister, a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling, and Mrs. Chen was wiping tears from her eyes. They signed the marriage certificate, making it official, and then they were back outside in the bright spring sunshine, married, bound together for life. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Nash?" Connor asked as he helped Florence into the wagon. "It feels right," Florence said. "Like everything finally makes sense." They stopped at the general store so Connor could pick up supplies, and Florence noticed the stares and whispers that followed them. Word had clearly spread about the mail-order bride who had broken her commitment to Martin Whitfield. Some of the looks were judgmental, disapproving, but others seemed merely curious. Florence lifted her chin and ignored them all. She had made her choice and she would live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, the wagon creaking along the rutted roads, the mountains rising beautiful and snow capped in the distance. Mrs. Chen had packed a lunch, and they stopped to eat beside a creek that was running high with snowmelt, the water crystal clear and cold. "I have something for you," Connor said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and handed it to Florence. She opened it to find a simple gold band, worn smooth with age. "Connor, it is beautiful." "It was my mother's," he said. "She died when I was 15. My father gave it to me before he passed, told me to give it to the woman I married someday. I want you to have it." Florence's throat tightened with emotion. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I will treasure it always." "I know you will." Connor took her hand, looking at the ring on her finger with satisfaction. "You are really mine now." "I was yours from the moment you carried me through that storm," Florence said. "I just did not know it yet." They arrived back at the ranch in the late afternoon. Mrs. Chen, with remarkable tact, announced she was going to visit her cousin in Coloma for a few days, giving them privacy. Connor protested, saying it was not necessary, but Mrs. Chen was adamant. "Newlyweds need time alone," she said firmly. "I will be back in 3 days. Try not to burn the house down while I am gone." And then she was gone, and Connor and Florence were truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. The evening was quiet and intimate. They made a simple supper together, working side by side in the kitchen, and Florence found she liked this, the domestic simplicity of cooking with her husband. They ate at the big wooden table, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the future. Connor wanted to expand his herd, maybe try breeding horses more seriously. Florence talked about starting a garden, maybe some chickens of her own. As darkness fell, Connor built up the fire and they sat together, Florence leaning against his chest, his arms wrapped around her. It was peaceful and perfect, and Florence felt a contentment she had never known before. "No regrets?" Connor asked softly. "Not a single one." "You? My only regret is that blizzard did not happen sooner," he said, making her laugh. That night, in Connor's big bed, they came together as husband and wife, and it was both awkward and beautiful, tender and passionate. Connor was patient and gentle, and Florence felt safe in his arms, cherished in a way she had never experienced. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The days turned into weeks, and Florence settled fully into her new life. She learned to bake bread in the big oven, to churn butter, to preserve food for the winter months ahead. Connor taught her more about riding, and soon she was confident enough to ride out with him when he checked on the cattle. She learned to recognize the landmarks of their property, the boundaries that marked where their land ended and the neighbors began. They did not see Martin Whitfield, though Connor said he heard from other ranchers that Whitfield had found another bride, a widow from Sacramento who seemed well suited to his temperament. Florence was glad. She had no ill will toward the man, despite his harsh words. She understood his anger and his pride, even if she could not regret the choice she had made. Spring deepened into summer, and the ranch thrived. Connor hired a few seasonal workers to help with the cattle, and Florence found herself managing a household with multiple people to feed and care for. It was hard work, but she loved it, loved feeling useful and needed, loved watching Connor come in from a long day's work and seeing his face light up when he saw her. They fell into easy routines, comfortable patterns that felt like they had been doing this for years rather than months. Connor was not demonstrative with his affection in public, but in private he was tender and loving, always making sure Florence knew how much she meant to him. And Florence, who had spent so much of her life feeling invisible and unimportant, bloomed under his attention like a flower in the sun. One evening in early July, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Florence realized something that made her heart skip. "Connor," she said carefully, "I think I might be with child." He went very still beside her, and for a moment she worried about his reaction. Then he turned to her, his face full of wonder and joy. "Are you sure?" "Not completely. But the signs are there. I think it happened quickly." Connor laughed, actually laughed out loud, and pulled her into his arms. "A baby. We are going to have a baby. You are happy." "Happy does not begin to cover it." He kissed her long and deep. "You have given me everything, Florence. A home, a future, and now a child. I love you so much." "I love you too," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Florence dealt with morning sickness and fatigue in the early months, but Connor was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over more of the household tasks when she was too tired or ill to manage them. Mrs. Cheng clucked over her like a mother hen, making sure she rested and ate properly. As fall arrived and the air turned crisp, Florence's belly began to swell noticeably. Connor would put his hand on her stomach in the evenings, feeling for kicks, his face full of awe whenever the baby moved. They talked about names, about plans for the future, about all the things they wanted to teach their child. One afternoon in late October, Connor came in from working with the horses to find Florence sitting at the table, tears streaming down her face. He was at her side instantly, kneeling beside her chair. "What is wrong? Is it the baby?" "No, no, the baby is fine." Florence wiped at her tears, laughing a little at herself. "I just realized something. I am happy, Connor, truly, completely happy. And I have not been able to say that in so long, maybe ever, that it overwhelmed me." Connor kissed her wet cheeks, her forehead, her lips. "You deserve this happiness. You deserve everything good." "So do you," she said. "We both deserve this." Winter came, and with it the anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together. Florence was heavily pregnant now, waddling more than walking, uncomfortable but glowing with health. Connor had become impossibly protective, barely letting her do anything, insisting she rest and let others handle the work. "You will spoil me," she protested. "That is the plan," he said, completely unapologetic. The baby came on a cold February night, during another snowstorm, though nothing like the blizzard of the year before. Mrs. Chen served as midwife, and Connor paced outside the bedroom door, wearing a path in the floorboards with his nervous energy. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Florence thought she could not do it, could not endure another contraction. But then she would hear Connor's voice through the door, calling encouragement, reminding her how strong she was, and she would find the strength to continue. Just before dawn, their son was born, small and perfect and howling with indignation at being thrust into the cold world. Mrs. Cheng cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Florence's arms. "He is beautiful," Florence breathed, staring down at the tiny face, the wisps of dark hair, the little fists waving in the air. Connor was allowed in then, and he came to the bedside, his face full of wonder. "A son," he whispered. "We have a son." "What should we name him?" Florence asked. They had discussed names but never quite settled on one. Now, looking down at their child, Connor said, "James, after my father, James Nash." "James," Florence repeated, testing it out. "I like it. Hello, James. Welcome to the world." The baby settled down at the sound of her voice, his eyes trying to focus on her face. Connor reached out one finger and James grabbed it with his tiny hand, holding on with surprising strength. "He is strong," Connor said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." Those early weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful. Florence was constantly tired, her body recovering from childbirth while adapting to the demands of feeding and caring for an infant. But every time she looked at James, every time Connor held their son with such tender care, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she now lived. Spring came again, bringing warmth and new growth. James was 3 months old now, a fat, happy baby who smiled easily and rarely cried. Connor doted on him shamelessly, carrying him around the ranch, showing him the horses and the cattle, talking to him about everything even though the baby obviously understood nothing. "You are going to spoil him," Florence said, watching from the porch as Connor walked the fence line with James cradled in one arm. "That is a father's right," Connor called back, grinning. One afternoon, as Florence was working in her garden, she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a small group of riders coming up the road. As they got closer, she recognized Richard Sterling, the lawyer who had been stranded with them during the blizzard. With him were 2 women and another man. Connor came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Sterling." "This is a surprise." "A pleasant one, I hope," Sterling said, dismounting. "I was passing through the area and thought I would stop by, see how you and your bride were getting on. These are my associates, Miss Helen Wright and Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, and this is my partner, Thomas Green." Introductions were made all around, and Florence invited everyone inside for refreshments. Mrs. Chen produced coffee and fresh bread with butter, and they all settled around the big table. "I have thought of you both often," Sterling said. "That storm, the way everything worked out. It seemed almost like fate." "It was fate," Connor said firmly, his hand finding Florence's under the table. "Best thing that ever happened to me." "And what about you, Miss Davies, or rather Mrs. Nash? Any regrets about your choice?" Florence looked around the room, at the home she had made, then out the window to where she could see Connor's land stretching out under the wide blue sky. She thought about James sleeping peacefully in his cradle in the bedroom, about the garden she had planted, about the life she had built here with the man she loved. "Not a single regret," she said. "This is where I am meant to be." Sterling smiled. "I am glad to hear it. The world needs more stories with happy endings." They spent a pleasant afternoon with Sterling and his companions, sharing stories and news from the wider world. When the visitors finally departed, promising to return if they were ever in the area again, Connor and Florence stood on the porch, waving goodbye. "This life we have," Connor said, putting his arm around Florence's waist. "It is everything I never knew I wanted." "For me too," Florence said, leaning into him. "Who would have thought a blizzard could be such a blessing?" "The storm brought you to me," Connor said. "That makes it the best storm in history." Florence laughed and kissed him, there on the porch of their ranch, with the mountains rising in the distance and the future stretching out before them, full of promise and possibility. Years passed, bringing change and growth to the Nash ranch. James grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy with his father's eyes and his mother's smile. 2 years after James came another son, William, who was quieter and more thoughtful. Then, 3 years later, a daughter, Rose, who had Connor wrapped around her little finger from the moment she was born. The ranch prospered under Connor's management and Florence's careful household economy. They added more land, built a new barn, expanded the house to accommodate their growing family. Mrs. Chen remained with them, transitioning from housekeeper to beloved grandmother figure to the children, who adored her. Florence never did return to Philadelphia, never looked back at the life she had left behind. Everything she needed was here in this place, with this man and the family they had built together. She thought sometimes about the advertisement she had answered, about Martin Whitfield and the life she might have had. She heard, through occasional gossip, that Whitfield had remarried and had children of his own, seemed reasonably content with his life. She was glad for him, held no bitterness about their failed arrangement. Because that storm, that unexpected detour, had brought her exactly where she needed to be. On a spring evening, nearly 10 years after the blizzard that had changed everything, Florence stood on the porch watching the sunset. Connor came up behind her, his arms going around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood like that often now, comfortable in their silence, needing no words to communicate their contentment. "You ever think about it?" Connor asked. "That day the stage coach arrived during the storm." "All the time," Florence said. "How close I came to missing this, to living a completely different life. I think about it too. How empty this house was before you, how lonely I was without even realizing it." "We were both waiting," Florence said. "We just did not know what we were waiting for until we found each other." From inside the house came the sound of children laughing, Mrs. Chen's voice telling them to settle down before bed. It was a good sound, full of life and love and normalcy. This was their life now, the one they had built together from that chance meeting during a blizzard. "Thank you," Connor said softly. "For what? For staying, for choosing me, for building this life with me." Florence turned in his arms so she could face him. His face had changed over the years, weathered by sun and wind and hard work, but his eyes were the same, that remarkable storm cloud gray-blue that had captured her from the first moment. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "For giving me a home, a family, a purpose. For loving me." "That was easy," Connor said, kissing her gently. "Loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done." They went inside together, into the warm, bright house full of their children and laughter and love. This was where Florence was meant to be, where she had always been meant to be, even when she thought she was heading somewhere else entirely. Sometimes, she thought, fate worked in mysterious ways. Sometimes it took a blizzard to show you where you truly belonged. And she belonged here, with Connor, in this ranch house in the California mountains, living a life she had never imagined but could no longer imagine living without. The mail-order bride who never made it to her destination had found something better. A true home, a deep love, and a future full of hope. The storms would come again, as they always did in the mountains, but Florence no longer feared them. She had learned that sometimes storms brought not disaster but opportunity, not endings but new beginnings. That first blizzard had stranded her at Connor's ranch, and he had said the words that proved to be prophetic. "This is where you are meant to be." He had been right. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and she would not change a single thing about the journey that had brought her here.